or 5 years of intensive and extensive consultations. And here the key is that it's not a technocratic exercise, it's an exercise in reconciling a wide range of divergent views about where is the appropriate level of standards for safeguards. And then ultimately then achieving that consensus among stakeholders, be they clients or advocacy NGOs. And this isn't always that easy. My second point is about policy architecture. And these are fundamental issues. Should there be one umbrella framework covering environment and social safeguards? Should they be separate? Should there be a separation between aspirational elements and compliance requirements that need to be undertaken for the project? Should there be a separation between policy principles and procedural requirements, like the 120-day rule that was mentioned by Stephanie? And what is the appropriate balance between upstream project preparation and downstream implementation? And really, the key to resolving these kinds of questions of balance is to recognize that safeguards are not a one-shot deal that happen at a certain point, but it's an ongoing process throughout the project cycle. My third point is about policy convergence. And here I just want to say that compared to about 10, 15, 20 years ago, now what we're seeing is incredible convergence across the multilateral development banks in terms of what we consider to be the appropriate principles that underpin safeguards. We're seeing commercial banks taking up the Equator Principles, subscribing to the same set. And really, there's common ground here on what constitutes good EIA practice, what is voluntary resettlement, what is best practice when it comes to planning and implementation of voluntary resettlement, the importance of meaningful consultation, disclosure, and this is all very good. So I think there isn't really much debate about what constitutes the key set of principles that must be there. The other part of the convergence equation is what we're seeing in our developing member countries. That is, over the last couple of decades, they too have moved up the curve and evolved their own safeguard policies, which are looking increasingly good, at least on paper. Certainly the EIA systems are approximating everything that one would associate with international practice, with a few gaps here and there. On voluntary resettlement and land acquisition, we're seeing a similar process, but it's lagging behind environment. Environment started earlier. On indigenous peoples, it's still all over the place. But what we're seeing is that within countries, their systems are increasing. And the question here is really, how do you maintain your own safeguards in the context of projects while not undermining the integrity and respect for the country's own systems? And in a context where there are strong systems, where the systems are being strengthened, eventually over time, use of those systems will lead to more ownership, better development impact, less transaction costs, than you have in a ring-fenced situation. My fourth point is about capacity, and here I just wanted to emphasize one thing we found when we were able to argue with our board and we talked about policy is you need capacity to implement. The frivolous policy with all the bells and whistles will mean nothing if you don't have capacity to deliver on it. That's why we increased our staffing by 60% on safeguards, as I mentioned earlier, particularly in our operations departments, and that's why we are investing $30 million in strengthening capacity in the safeguard systems across the region. My fourth point is on the, or fifth point rather, lost track here, is on the principle of proportionality. And here, I just wanted to say that the safeguard response needs to be proportional to the safeguard risk. And a one-size-fits-all approach clearly doesn't make sense, where it's a simple project, you don't need a sophisticated baseline, where it's a complex, sensitive project, you might. So there's a lot of professional judgment that's required in the delivery of safeguards. My sixth point is about grievance redress, and I think grievance redress is crucial to any functioning safeguard system and policy framework. things can and will go wrong, and there's a need to have an appropriate system so that affected people know where to turn at project level, seek solutions before the problems escalate, and allow project teams to address the issues. And obviously, as a key part of this, but as the last line of defense, is inspection panel or liquidity mechanism, where any affected person can send complaints directly to the financier. I'm glad that our members of our accountability mechanism will with us today. And then I was going to say a few words about the IED study. But I'm going to say that I used up my allocation. But on the IED study, I found that it's very useful. It's an interim study, interim independent evaluation, which was focused primarily on financial intermediation and country safeguard systems. The full evaluation that development policy will take place starting later this year, I understand, from our IED colleagues. And they hope to complete the full evaluation by mid next year. And that will be a very useful exercise, we hope, because it will point us in the right direction for any future evolution of ADB's own safeguard policies. But some of the findings of the IED study are useful. We agree that quality of environmental assessments needs to be more uniform. Due diligence of financial intermediation needs attention. Supervision is important. We're going forward with it. And of course, training and capacity development of staff is highly important. The IED study also made a very strong recommendation on country safeguard systems. Not so much the strength of this thing, we're doing that already and we're doing a good job there. But IED said we should be much more aggressive in using country systems. And that was a very clear recommendation of the study. In management's response, we said, we can go forward in the use of country systems, but only where there is equivalence between the country system and ADB's requirements, and where there's capacity to deliver on country systems. So there's a slight divergence of view there. I think IED is a lot more gung-ho about the more wholesale switch to country safeguard systems. I think management is taking a somewhat more cautious approach there. I'll use it for time to ask. Thank you very much.
Okay, these are the three presentations of first round. So I want to open the floor for Q&A. But we will have, as I said, this is not for general debate, more Q&A. If you have any questions about three presentations, and also to other panel, you can also ask questions each other. Let's see how many. Who wants to raise questions? Any comment? Okay, one. Okay. Those want to speak Russian, we have an interpretation, Russian and English, so I will let you know. Wait. Please come to the microphone. Please identify yourself.
Sure.
Gretchen Ward with Bank Human Rights Coalition. Question for, I guess, all of you, but in particular, Nassim. I'm wondering what your assessment is of how the current ADB safeguards cover off on identifying social risks and impacts. If you look at the way the safeguards are organized, there's much more focus on, there's an environmental policy. Social seems to be folded into a PSIA or maybe another policy, but does not have prominence. And in terms of what you mentioned in terms of the evolution of practice within country systems, while I'd agree that there's been a lot of development in knowledge about and practice of environmental impact assessment, I wouldn't say that's the case on social impact assessment, and there's still a lot to be done there. So I'm wondering what ADB is doing, what the ADB can do to make sure that social risks beyond just risks to indigenous peoples and involuntary resettlement, the whole scope of social risks are caught.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Alessandra Furtado, I'm with Lineage for Disability from London. Following our colleague's question, what also is the ADB doing in terms of inclusion, not necessarily risks, but how do we then ensure that, talking about inclusive growth, that all sectors of society are included? So moving a little bit away from risks, but into how do we ensure that the right thing is being done?
Okay, thank you very much. Any more questions? None, and then can I give 2 or 3 minutes to respond to these 2 questions, and then we'll move to the second round. So we have also another, after the second round, we have another chance. Okay. Okay, who wants to speak first?
Thank you for those questions, which are good ones. One was looking at how to optimize the safeguard policy framework. The ADB's current safeguard policy does cover just environment, involuntary resettlement, and indigenous peoples. And at the time it was being formulated, there was recognition that our social protection strategy covered all the other elements of social justice and social development. And there was a policy decision to have those separate without incorporating both of them in one policy framework. But ultimately, the architecture of the safeguard policy would allow for ordinary standards and other issues to be incorporated. So I would imagine in a future update that one might go the route which has been followed by other banks of having one omnibus policy that we can use, as I mentioned. And I see merit in that simply because the greater clarity it would offer. Within our DMCs, I agree that environment has had much longer time to gestate and evolve, and that's why what we see now is EIA systems that are pretty much international best practice with gaps or perhaps in information disclosure and in some cases consultation requirements. But on social, the journey is going to be it's still there, and it's going to be a sort of medium-term journey, with the exceptions some sectors or some agencies at the sector level where they might have policies of their own in place to deliver on involuntary settlement or indigenous people's issues. On the second set of questions on inclusive growth, generally in our review of our long-term strategic framework, we put a lot of emphasis on this issue, and in our midterm review action plan, we are promoting our inclusive growth strategy, where it has 3 pillars: economic growth being fundamental for access to opportunities, to participate in that growth being the second pillar, and the third one being social protection and safety nets to ensure that nobody is left out. So that's more overall policy framework for this what I would call the do good agenda as opposed to the do no harm agenda embodied in safeguards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nassim. Stephanie and Corina, will you respond to the 2 questions? Social risk and inclusion.
These were good questions. Thank you for raising them. I guess there are a couple of points that come to mind immediately. One, we're talking about, I guess Nassim gave us this image of the convergence. So convergence of safeguards in public, private financial institutions, a conversion of environmental impact assessments at national levels. But we actually need to unpack that a bit, because there are massive differences between safeguards that are mandatory versus those that are voluntary. So when we look at the Equator Principles, many of our colleagues who track those banks find that the Equator Principles in many cases are useless, very difficult, because there are no mandatory requirements. And so even though the language may look the same, if it doesn't have a mandatory hook, very different in creature. When we're looking at national standards, and in fact, in many of the environmental impact assessment laws around the region in Asia and many countries, social impact is considered a part of the environmental impact assessment. But I just came back from Washington at the World Bank annual meetings, traveling with colleagues from Chinese NGO and Indonesian NGO. And their entire message that they were bringing to the World Bank was that, yes, in writing we have some beautiful language. However, the actual implementation of this language is a nightmare. And from our Indonesian colleagues, they documented how in Indonesia, technically you would have community input on an environmental impact assessment, but this would be one individual chosen by the government to sit on a team that discusses the terms of reference, and then finally one person that's on the team for actually doing the EIA. And what's happening now is in this push for infrastructure, I attended a meeting just an hour ago at Standard & Poor put on about investment in Indonesia and China. In Indonesia, one of the biggest threats to investment is the fact that it's difficult to obtain land acquisition, difficult for companies to obtain land. Right now in Indonesia, what's happening is that they are vastly reducing the speed with which land can be taken. They're reducing the length of environmental impact assessments. It was over 120 days, then it's 75 days. For an environmental permit to be issued in Indonesia for a project of significant impact, there are 10 days of public comment. For a category B type project, there are 2 days of public comment. This is after the EIA. Land acquisition and land clearing happens prior to the EIA process, even though that's not supposed to be the case. So while, and Indonesia is an interesting case because right now the Asian Development Bank has technical assistance, I believe, to ascertain the extent to which Indonesia's country system can be used. And so I don't know if you have specifics on that. Right now the Indonesian government is dismantling the country's anti-corruption commission, which is the commission that has put in prison hundreds of government officials and legislators. And so with that being dismantled, how do you have a handle on corruption? How do you use country systems? So I guess the context of country systems, when you're looking at protection for various classes of individuals, if the safeguards are not mandatory, and if the checking to see who's impacted isn't done prior to the money being dispersed, you have very little chance of being engaged in that discussion. I will agree that the safeguards provide a framework where those discussions can definitely happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, also thank you for the excellent questions, but I would like to highlight what Stephanie already said, that although desirable, of course, to expand the coverage of the existing safeguards, implementation is one of the biggest challenges that they're actually facing. As part of the environmental impact assessment policies, there are the social impacts are covered. But as we've seen, especially with regards to the World Bank's recent admission concerning involuntary resettlement, the institution admits it has not properly followed its own requirements on involuntary resettlement, and so millions of people have been forcibly resettled without that they have a clue of what actually happened to them as a result of this resettlement. Also, the requirement was that these people not be left worse off than they were initially before being resettled. So there's a lot of things that need to be done on implementation first and foremost.
Thank you. So let's move to the second round of presentations. We are going to listen to very concrete cases. The first round we discuss more policy framework, but second round we go to more ground, we listen to the ground goals and so concrete cases. First speaker will be Titi from Indonesia. So Indonesia was mentioned by previous speakers, so maybe you can also say something about Indonesia. We have 10 minutes.
So, thank you, Chair. Thank you for Ryan to invite us from Indonesia to talk about the safeguards and development financing. I think it's time to discuss about this. Recently, I attended some conferences related to the development financing, and it struck me all the time that if we talk about development financing, then we talk only about finance and financial risk, but not other risks that we know cover, for example, in safeguard. Therefore, it is important that we go putting back what is actually development for us. So we really work hard to achieve agreement, whether through the country and through the UN, to have a sustainable development goal, which is to promote prosperity, to promote economic opportunity, social welfare, and protection of the environment. So the lives of people everywhere will be improved, the environment will be maintained, and the natural resources will be intact. That's the goal of the sustainable development. We need to think always in that direction. And then in this term, there are dimensions that we have to look at, or we have to pay attention at, if we talk about investment financing for sustainable development. That is gender dimension, age, disability, social, economic, cultural, and political dimension, and consistent with the human rights frameworks. Because we talk about people, we don't talk about the road only. The road is for people, it's not for other purposes. So if we talk about financing development, it is financing for reaching welfare, to protect environment, social protection, and also to empower the people. And then the roles in this whole activity for financing of development is the states as a duty bearers with on the right-based framework. If we look at the discussions on the financing for sustainable development recently, whether at the UN level, at the regional level, they tend to give all the obligations and mandate of the Constitution to create the welfare to people to the private sectors, which not have a development mandate. Private sector has its own mandate to achieve profits. So, and then we need also to think about the obligation of the businesses to respect human rights. Because we are talking about the context of development, which is the welfare of people. We don't talk about the welfare of companies if we talk about sustainable development. So if we talk about risk on investment to development financing, next. Usually if we hear a lot of conversations, the primary is thinking about financial risk. So financial risk by ignoring the risks related to gender dimension, age dimension, disability, social, economic, cultural, and political dimension. And then we see, because the ignorance to those dimensions, then we see land grabbing as a result. We see a loss of livelihood because of the land grabbing or because of the pollutions. Environmental pollution, destruction of natural resources, and human rights violations. Why it's occurred, why it's happened? Because the ignorance to those dimensions for the welfare of people. So what happens is now we see a lot of development are promoted highly, but we see on the ground is an impoverishment, lack of achievement of sustainable development goals. And then if you look at the financial itself, then it's a bad reputational risk actually for the financial, because all the finance is actually only triggered problems on the ground. And then it's create financial problems to them. One of the example of financial risk, if you see the case of the case of water privatizations, pushed a lot by the World Bank and the ADB through several technical assistance and loan for the water restructuring activities. So in 18th of February, the Indonesian Constitutional Court annulled Indonesian law about that also contain phrases on the privatization. because they say that water is included in the public legal system and cannot be made as the object of ownership in the concept of civil law. You know? And then if you look at the decisions of the Central Jakarta district, which is also ruled and canceled the contract between the Jakarta governors and the private companies that work on the privatization. So it means it can happen because there's a lot of pressure by people who are affected by lack of water, clean water, drinking water, and then the promises through the policy supported by the World Bank and ADB by saying a better bureaucracy, better management of water will provide better supply of water to people. In fact, not. People see there's a problems, heavy burden to their life because of this water system. So they went to the court and then they win. So that's a reputation, if you see, there will be a reputation of risk if the investors, they ignore the social, political, economical dimensions of the investment, which is in contradictions to the objective of the sustainable development. So that looks at the safeguard of the MDBs and the development financing. The question is whether the financing, the financial support of the MDBs contribute to welfare, empowerment, and social protection? That's the question. Because we also face the reality that the MDB safeguard tend to be diluted to facilitate the investment and the needs of the private sectors to have a bigger chunk in the investment to the country. And then we see also, if you look at the provisions related to the safeguard, there are not only safeguard but many other policies. That's really protective to the private investment. And then indeed there's a good policy formulated like the SPS of 2009 of ADB, but there's gaps in the implementation. So if you look closer to the ADB safeguard policy statement, this paper is a strong